Hello, everyone. Welcome to Living the Breakthrough, T1D Stories, where we have conversations with people who break through the challenges of living with T1D to achieve whatever they want in life, both big and small. My name is Adrian Gonzalez, and I'm a board member with the Greater New England chapter of Breakthrough T1D. And my guest today is Marley McMillan, who is a broadcaster, athlete, and businesswoman. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College, where she played Division I women's hockey, which I think is so cool because I can barely skate from here to there. So I can't even imagine, skating around the ice and chasing a puck around and everything like that. She also received her MBA from Vanderbilt University, and she's had a successful career across the broadcast media and sports industries. So I was introduced to Marley recently by a mutual friend, and I loved her story and how she's living the breakthrough. So I invited her to be in the program, and she said yes. So here we are. So Marley, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Adrian. Thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone listening and watching.
Great. Well, thank you, Marley. You know, let's get started like we always do in this program, right? Which is really, how your T1D story, began. So why don't we start there? I mean, when and how did you get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes? And what do you remember about that day or that time period?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed almost 7 years ago. It was May of 2018, May, June. A bit of an interesting diagnosis story, I think. Again, I was 30 years old at the time, so that's already a bit maybe different than a lot of people think of when they think of type 1 diabetes. But I wasn't sick, and I went in for a routine OBGYN visit, actually. And they just happened to take my glucose. They just happened to take my blood sugar. And that came back pretty high. And I didn't know anything about diabetes at the time. Didn't, you kind of get those test results and say, okay, I don't know, because it was with a lot of other test results as well. And I ended up sharing it with my family, and they sort of said, well, no, that's really something you should follow up on and go back in and figure out. And so I did that. I went back in, but still to just my OBGYN, and got an A1C, and that was very elevated. Again, I wasn't sick, but and then the way that I sort of had any sort of indication of this might mean diabetes was I received a medical message. As you know, we might all be familiar with patient portals these days, which are great, but in this case was a bit of a challenge. Because I received the message that sort of showed where I landed on the A1C reading relative to normal, and a note that said you might have diabetes. See an endocrinologist, and so that was pretty surprising, and I didn't know what to do with that information, and it also, by the time it started to feel very concerning, that felt like such an interesting way to have found out, I guess, what, potentially is a lifelong disease that you might now be living with. So I tried to make an appointment with an endocrinologist. As a lot of people's stories, right? It's the beginning is a bit of a winding and rocky road, and certainly, I think of other people that are really sick, and thankfully I wasn't, but couldn't get in to see an endocrinologist for another 6 weeks or so. I ended up talking to just friends, kind of trying to advocate for myself. I think I met with an internist because I could get in with them sooner. Communication was a little bit difficult to coordinate between these different people that I was trying to see as soon as possible. And all I was told in calling the doctor, calling nurses, trying to get any information at that time was, yeah, just don't eat sugar. Which is, again, I mean, a very simplified, it is important, but a very simplified version of what you might do if you realize you're diabetic. So yeah, so that beginning was tough. But I ultimately was, diagnosed with type 1, sat down by myself, for these appointments, and taught how to use insulin, and what, your new normal is going to look like. And yeah, it was really scary. It was really isolating. That's kind of why I was really interested and motivated to chat with you, Adrian. I do think that as many of these sort of lived experiences and day-to-day experiences that we have as type 1, being able to share those and relate with others is so important because I remember that feeling of getting diagnosed and not and despite being 30 years old and you're an adult and can handle this in a different way than someone who's diagnosed really young. And but it's challenging in that way, in the same by the same token, in that you're maybe not as connected, or relying on sort of like a community with you to handle this new diagnosis. So yeah, so happy to be here, happy to share about my experience, and yeah, that's kind of how it started.
Wow, it's amazing. I mean, I can relate, just as a parent, with my daughter getting diagnosed and not knowing anything about what T1D was. And she wasn't sick either, but luckily, the path from, hey, she went in for her physical. That's how she found out. She had a high blood glucose level, but then immediately, like I think that same day, she went to see an endocrinologist, and boom, the process started. That
Right.
process for you was very drawn out and bumpy. I mean, you go in for just your regular OBGYN appointment, you get some results, blood work results or urine results that, indicate something, but then you're kind of bounced around until you finally get to meet with endocrinologists and get your, the diagnosis solidified, if you will, and get you on insulin and so forth. I mean, I think I think it just unfortunately speaks to just the state of the medical environment, these days. And I think it's fortunate that you weren't sick or it wasn't some kind of emergency situation because, it took so long, relatively speaking, for you to actually get the care you needed.
Right, right. Yeah, it was really interesting, right? It's not something and I realize this more and more, I think, as I move through the healthcare system in different ways. Like it's maybe, it's not something an OBGYN might be prepared to handle. And it's also, you and I had talked previously about the benefits of, getting these immediate results and communication, which is fantastic, but sometimes the bedside manner sort of falls away because of the benefit of being able to get those immediate results. And so as opposed to a story like maybe getting diagnosed where the doctor is right there and knows the weight of this diagnosis and calls you, I no, I didn't have a one-on-one conversation with a doctor for, weeks after those initial glucose and A1C readings. So it was very confusing, and ultimately everyone was trying to do their best, right? And I had ultimately had conversations about, how can we improve this in the way that this happened. But I was, yeah, bounced around to different doctors who hadn't known what I'd already been diagnosed with. I mentioned to you that, after being on insulin for 3 weeks, I ended up, I think, finally actually seeing an endocrinologist, and the endocrinologist asked me if I had type 1 diabetes. And I was just thinking to myself, this is the first time I'm seeing an endocrinologist, and I've been on insulin for 3 weeks, and you're asking me if I have type 1 diabetes. Like, what is going on here? So it really was a winding road, and I know people have really difficult diagnoses, and any diagnosis is difficult, so there's no hiding that,
Yeah.
but yeah, it was definitely a rough start.
Yeah, well, I think it speaks to, the need for further education across certainly the medical community. And I think it speaks to the other part that you brought up. And I know we talked about this when we first met. It's great on the one hand that we all have this kind of instant access to blood work and x-rays and everything else. We get that email that says, hey, your results are in. But the
Right.
flip side is that, you open it up, and if there's something that's out of the ordinary, it's hard for you to interpret what's going on. And then it's very difficult to have that conversation with someone who can help, interpret it. These days, the funny thing is, my wife actually had a MRI done of her back, and she got the results back, and everything is just medical lingo. She hasn't had a chance to talk to a doctor yet. And I said, why don't you just copy and paste that into Chat GPT and see if so just say, can you interpret, put this into layman's terms, so I understand maybe what the results are. I mean, I think that's where we are today. Unfortunately, you get this fast results, but then you don't have that, personal care and that human interaction to really, help explain it to you and help navigate you with what is a scary thing for someone that gets diagnosed with something, whatever it is, and you don't understand what it is. I think the other interesting thing is that you were diagnosed when you were 30 years old, and I think that's a great example of why JDRF changed its name to Breakthrough T1D earlier this year. For a long time, type 1 diabetes was referred to as juvenile diabetes, but the fact is, and this surprised me when I saw these numbers. The fact is that according to recent studies, the median age of diagnosis for T1D is 24 years old, and 37% of people who are diagnosed after the age of 30, right? So this is not a juvenile, disease, but by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, those folks that were diagnosed as kids ultimately become adults as well and have to live through this. So I think that was part of obviously the driving force behind this. And maybe you touched upon this a little bit, but I mean, based on your experience, I mean, what do you see as the unique benefits or perhaps challenges of being diagnosed as an adult?
Yeah. Great question. And the first thing I kind of think of in terms of a benefit is, I had um, the luck of living without diabetes for 30 years. And so, um, there's obviously a benefit in that, I didn't grow up with it. I had uh, a childhood without type 1 diabetes. I played D1 college hockey without diabetes. So a lot of that life was not impacted by this disease, and I'm grateful for that. I think also in the way that when you're diagnosed as an adult, you have a level of being able to handle something like this, right? And so there are certain benefits like that. You and I were actually laughing about the fact that when you are diagnosed really young, your parents are very involved. And I'm thinking now, if my parents were texting me about my blood sugar levels, which I think is the reality for a lot of kids that grow up with type 1, I certainly don't have that, which is funny. Although I do have that relationship with my partner. But yeah, I think, really, having had lived a lot of life without it, I'm grateful for that. By the same token, the other side of that, of course, is that it's kind of a maybe more serious mourning period of your previous life. And of course, you're aware, okay, this is not my life anymore, and I can't live this way anymore when you've had a significant portion of your life lived without type 1. And then, I also think when you're diagnosed as an adult, again, you are, more empowered and more equipped to handle it. But at the same time, and this might just be the way I was diagnosed, but I was a 30-year-old single person going to these doctor's appointments that were really, really scary and isolating. And, as a 30-year-old person, you're sort of like, well, I'm a self-sufficient working professional. I don't need to bring my parents to these doctor's appointments. But in hindsight, I probably should have, because they were devastating appointments. And when you're, an adult, you do just think, okay, I just handle this on my own because I'm an adult. But having that immediate sort of support network, people being with you when you are receiving news and going through such a significant lifestyle change, I think is really important. And getting connected to community as well. The sort of not only, being in those appointments and support network, but additional finding of other type 1s was something that I didn't really have, or I wasn't introduced to a community at that point. I was sort of grasping at straws, trying to think of anyone that might know something about this, and what's my life about to be like. Yeah, definitely, definite benefits, but definitely also a kind of a challenging side to it as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think at the end of the day, there is no good age to get diagnosed with, type 1
Right.
diabetes, right? I mean, I think for my daughter who was diagnosed at 11, I know she was the first interviewee of this program, and I remember her saying, I mean, I can't remember if she said in the program or just in our conversations that, she almost doesn't remember anymore life without type 1
Right.
diabetes, just because
Right.
she's lived longer with diabetes than she did without it, right? And certainly for those that are born, get diagnosed as infants or toddlers, I mean, they don't remember, life, this has just been the way it always is. And I think the point about community is also, important, and helpful because, again, just for my daughter, I know when she's participating in Breakthrough T1D events, the first time she participated, she's like, wow, this is the first time where I'm not like the minority in the room. Like I'm with my people here, right? Like
Yeah.
they understand what I go through. We're all living through these same challenges. So, there's the sense of, when you're the only one at school or the only one in your workplace that's perhaps dealing with this, yeah, it could be lonely and a little bit isolating, at first. But finding a community, of folks that are going through the same challenges, we're able to share advice and insights and so forth, I think is empowering and powerful. All right, we got to talk about the hockey now. But, as I
Oh.
mentioned in the my opening comments, I mean, that impresses me a lot. I mean, my daughter plays rugby, which is another very rough and physical sport. Hockey the same way. You didn't have T1 when you were playing hockey in college, but you've continued to play hockey, and obviously you're athletic in other ways as well. I mean, what's it been like managing diabetes as an athlete, and do you have a routine or things that you do to minimize the risk of going too high or too low, during a game or just athletic activity?
Yeah, so good question. And my initial response is, what a lot of type ones I feel like might say about just living with the disease, period, which is just that it's chaos. But and then I also think of, just per our last question as well, is that a lot of people will think of me as almost like still a relatively new type one. And in this way, I think I still feel this way. And maybe because again, like my athletic career is different now in the last, 10 years than it was my whole life. But yeah, as an athlete, it's still hard for me to figure out, and every athletic experience is different, right? So going on a walk with my mom for an hour is a different experience than going to play hockey. Just a couple things that I try and do when I play hockey is maybe just start with stable blood sugars, try and have them be in range and in a manageable place, not too high, not too low. Have glucose on the bench. I actually often take my pump off. And again, this is one of those things that I think everybody does differently, and that's why it's fun to find those people and actually talk about it with them. But I actually take it off because it'll continue to give you insulin, and I try not to have insulin on board if I'm playing certain sports because it's just automatically going to crash. But those are kind of the maybe absolute basics. But it's so interesting once you get into exercise, because again, hockey's so different from walking. Even within hockey, if I play a certain position versus a different position, my blood sugar is going to do different things. Hockey generally will actually spike my blood sugar, whereas, most of the time you think kind of exercise will bring it down. So it is kind of always different. But it hasn't been a really it hasn't been I haven't had any really scary experiences, I will say. And that might also just be with the, amount of sports that I'm playing these days. And it's different than being younger, playing every single day for hours and hours, right? But it's been manageable. Yeah, I still play as much as I possibly can, and I love it. And do other athletic activities as well. But yeah, it's I'm constantly figuring it out, and I'm constantly getting new tips. I think my endocrinologist maybe a month or maybe a year ago told me what she does because she's also type 1 actually, and it was like, oh, cool, okay, these tips you get from also, medical professionals, but also people that have it are really helpful.
Yeah, and that's great. And I know, just from my daughter's experience as well, first, everybody's different, right? So whatever strategies might work for you might not work for somebody else and
Right.
vice versa. And things that I've been, working having working for you 9 out of 10 times, is always going to be that 10th time that, it just doesn't work for whatever reason, because diabetes is going to do its own thing. So like you said at the beginning, it's just chaos sometimes, and it
Yeah.
is what it is, and you just have to roll with it. I mean, so you mentioned your pump. So just curious, I mean, how are you managing your diabetes? Do you have a pump? Do you have a continuous glucose monitor as well?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Some of those basic things, I feel like I jump into all the, theoretical of living, and I'm always so curious what people are actually using. So yeah, so I use a Dexcom G7 right now for my CGM, continuous glucose monitor, and then that communicates with my Tandem T-Slim pump, and I've been on that combination of devices for maybe close to 3 years now.
Now, if I remember correctly, when we first met, you said and correct me if I'm wrong, you started out with injections, and you kind of liked the fact that you started out that way, because you kind of understood kind of like the basics, if you will, because we all know that technology tends to fail sometimes, right?
Yeah. So I think this is maybe my general approach with a lot of things as well, is I wanted to master like the basic building blocks, and even potentially maybe more so than, I really needed to. In hindsight, I probably could have gone on a pump or a CGM within a year or even less. I don't know. But I really felt at the time when I was diagnosed that I wanted to start with the basic building blocks. So I did injections, I did just finger sticks, didn't have a CGM, didn't have a pump for a few years, I think, really. And I think, again, it was just the thought that not only is it a learning curve every time you switch a device, but it also is just, I think I didn't want to start a device and then have my backup plan be something I wasn't absolutely completely facile with. Whereas, when you do injections, when you do finger sticks, it's just absolutely rote in your mind to take out a test strip, test your blood sugar, put it back. Like, it doesn't even cross your mind that you're even doing it. I think that's just the level of comfort I wanted to have with, you know, when plan A fails, like, I'm so comfortable with plan B, C, D, E, et cetera. So that is what I did. And then, but I could not recommend a CGM and a pump combination more. It vastly improves, I think, your control and quality of life. And, I think if I were speaking to someone, if they were wondering if I would do that again, I might do injections and, test strips for a year or something like that, but then make that move. Although it just can be intimidating as well to move up to, switch what you're doing day to day.
Yeah, no, I agree. Having feeling comfortable and experience with a plan B, C, or D is very important. I always make the analogy of, and again, this is with my kids. God forbid their Waze or Google Maps doesn't work, because they will have no idea how to get from point A to point B, because they've never read a map before, right?
Right.
So, you should know how to read a map, and how to navigate, right, without the use of your smartphone and one of these navigation apps. And I think it's the same thing with, type 1 diabetes, right? If your CGM fails or your pump fails, do you have needles? Do you have do you have syringes? Do you have, the
Right.
ability to test your blood sugar? Do you have so forth? And are you comfortable doing that? Because ultimately, that pump's going to fail in the most inconvenient time,
Right.
and you're going to need to, have a plan B in place. So I think that's great advice. So let's shift gears completely now here. And you and your partner are expecting your second child. Is that right? Your, your
Yes.
second child in just a few short weeks here, which is so exciting. And of course, being pregnant without having T1D is challenging enough. So what's it like being pregnant with T1D? I mean, how has the disease impacted the experience for you? And any advice or things you've learned that perhaps other women might find helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. It's challenging. I feel like a broken record maybe with using that word. But when you're type 1 and you become pregnant, first of all, I think it's recommended in kind of the year prior, really, to becoming pregnant, that you are really focused on your glucose levels, and that, not that we're not always, but in a way that your range tightens up when you're pregnant. So you're no longer aiming for 70 to 180, you're aiming for 70 to 140. And if you can sort of get into that level of control, and get I think your A1C, they want it to be below 6 or something like that, prior to getting pregnant, or around 6. And so, like a year before becoming pregnant. And then once you actually become pregnant, of course, then you're in that tighter range. And it's kind of really, at that point, of course, like control is hard, period. But then it's the weight of knowing that, okay, I'm having this high and I ate a donut and that was my choice and that's affecting me, but now it's affecting somebody else, or it's what I'm doing is affecting another life. And so that can be a weighty experience. And then I think, just in terms of the care, more rigorous, right? So I at least saw throughout both of my pregnancies, I'm towards the end of my second pregnancy now, but an OBGYN, my endocrinologist, which is incredible. The program I'm a part of here is specifically a diabetes and pregnancy program. And so I see them along with, the ultrasound and whatever blood tests I have to do, once a month, or I see the diabetes, either nurse or an endocrinologist every 2 weeks as well. And then, towards the end of the pregnancy, I'm in there twice a week. So it's very thorough. You're watched very closely. There are additional complications. Of course, it is a high risk pregnancy when you're type 1 and having a baby. And it's like, I don't know if this is a good way to put it, but it's like kind of like diabetes on steroids a little bit, where it's just, we're all living with type 1. It's difficult. And then it sort of just like goes to the next level. You've made it to the next level in the video game of type 1 diabetes when you get pregnant. It's intense. I would say I was a lot more, I was very type A about it with my first pregnancy, and I of course am still very vigilant, and careful, with my second. But it's also when you're, maybe just the parent of the first child and the parent of the second child, it's you. I was able to relax a little bit better in the second pregnancy, and it's actually, I actually think it's benefited the pregnancy overall. So yeah, it is. Challenging, but not something that anyone with type 1 can't do. There are amazing resources for you to do it. I did find a lot of kind of communities and online and books to read about it and that type of thing. So yeah, it's another one of those things that, if you're type 1, you can absolutely still do it. And that's amazing. And but yeah, it's hard. And one of the phrases I think I got through Breakthrough Type 1, and something I was talking to with them was, you can do hard things, and that's one of them.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thank you for sharing your experience, with that. And I would imagine, again, I think this is one area where technology is, can help immensely, right? Because you talked about the need to be in much tighter control, particularly just preparing to get pregnant. And now with the, the newer systems, the closed loop systems where the, CGMs are talking to the, the pumps and trying to, particularly for overnights, to try to help get into that tighter control window. I would imagine that would be, extremely helpful, not only for the everyday, obviously, but particularly for people that are planning, to get pregnant and manage that through the pregnancy. So, okay, let's wrap it up, and let's wrap it up with kind of the question that we always end up with, and that's by looking ahead, towards the future, a future that all of us, can't wait for. So Breakthrough T1D's, vision is to create a world without T1D. So what would a world without T1D mean to you, Marley?
Wow, that question is breaks my brain basically. But I will say the first thing that I think of, I think, is just young people being diagnosed and not having that be a reality anymore. I think the first, again, kind of outreach I did to Breakthrough Type 1 Diabetes was when I was walking through the grocery store. This was maybe within the past year. And a young boy and his mom came up to me because they had seen my CGM and they had seen my pump, and he had been diagnosed a couple years prior. And he was, yeah, I mean, he might have been 10 years old. And they were so curious about my experience and did I enjoy my pump? And it's experiences like those that just absolutely kind of cut to the core of me, and now also being a mom and thinking about a 6-month-old baby or a 2-year-old being diagnosed. And so a world without type 1 diabetes, to not have kids be diagnosed with this, wow, I think that would be a beautiful day. And then of course, just personally, and I think anyone else living with type 1, the first thing I would say is just like the brain space that would open up for you if you didn't have type 1 anymore. Like, it's just an incredible, it's kind of like you've had a kid your whole life, which, is an amazing thing. That's a blessing. That's different than this. But, and all of a sudden, like, that whole part of your brain that is dedicated to thinking about that thing, 30% of the day, and on bad days 100% of the day, what would you do with that brain space? It would be absolutely incredible, and I know amazing research is being done. And again, one thing I missed out on saying, as someone that was diagnosed older, is, the one thing people always told me was, you're getting diagnosed at the best time. And, every day is like the best time now, just because of the incredible advances that have been able to be made. I mean, being diagnosed now or in the last 10 years is so different than being diagnosed, even 20, 30, and certainly, 50 years ago. So, incredibly sort of grateful for the research that's been done to advance people's lives with type 1 already. And if we were to get to having a cure, wow, that would be an absolutely incredible day.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. I mean, I remember when you said, open up your brain space, that you dedicate now to, having to think about and worry about, with type 1 diabetes. I remember when I first started researching and learning about this, when my daughter got diagnosed, I read a book and there was a quote from it that I still remember, where the doctor who wrote it, I think it was a doctor, said it, T1D is like a colicky baby that doesn't stop crying, right? Because it's always, so I think, World Without T1D is for that colicky baby to finally, fall asleep and not make a peep, for a very long time, right? So you can focus on the other things. Well, Marley, again, thank you very much, for making the time to be with us today, especially with everything you have going on with the holidays and obviously the pending arrival for a new family member. So all the best to you and your growing family, moving forward.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Great to talk to you, and thanks so much for having me.
Great. And for those of you, watching, if you enjoy this episode, please share it with your family and friends. And if you're living the breakthrough with type 1 diabetes and want to share your story, feel free to contact me and maybe you can be the next guest on Living the Breakthrough. Again, thank you for watching.